Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about how to equip your Contemptor Dreadnoughts for Horus Heresy, the Age of Darkness. We're going to go over the roles for different kinds of Dreadnoughts, the general considerations for your Dreadnought loadouts, all the different Dreadnought weapon options, the recommended loadouts, the things I would say are the better ones, and also how to use some of the weaker Dreadnought weapons as well. But before we do that, if you enjoy the show, please do like and subscribe on YouTube, and if you've got any feedback or thoughts at all, please leave them down in the comments below as you watch. And now, on with the show. Let's start by talking about the roles that different kinds of Dreadnoughts can take, because they do vary depending on how you equip them. So, firstly, you've got the Fire Support Dreadnought, which is just taking 2 guns, generally 2 of the same gun. Preferably long-range guns work best for this, so you can't be easily tied up in combat. So 2 Gravis Multi-Melters are, maybe not a great option because you have to go so close to use them and then you get tied up in combat, which your Dreadnought's not very good at. Doesn't have really a great damage output for its points, a Fire Support Dreadnought. So, if you use the double las cannon version, for example, it's not as many guns as you could cram into other units that do fire support as well. But what it is a very tough to kill gun platform, and it often gets ignored. I use a 4 las cannon Dreadnought quite a lot, and people don't even bother shooting at it most of the time because it's quite far away. It's hard to get to it with melee or short range guns like Melter or Grav to kill it, and therefore there's just no point shooting at it. So although it doesn't do great damage output for its points, it's very tough as well. Then you got the Melee Dreadnought. So the idea of the Melee Dreadnought is to put 2 melee weapons on it to make sure that you get that +1 attack. And the reason that's so worthwhile is that the attacks on Dreadnoughts are just so good. Whatever they are, Brutal 3 or the Chain Fist, every attack counts. And therefore, in this configuration, you're just going to maximize those attacks. For a lot of legions, you don't have access to Weapon Skill 5 melee as well. Now, Weapon Skill, rightly or wrongly, is very important in this game. And, I play Iron Hands as an example, as I'm sure you all know. And Iron Hands have got no good Weapon Skill 5 melee stuff, so you can use Dreadnoughts to fill in for that. So this kind of Dreadnought is good for any legion, but particularly for legions like Iron Hands or Iron Warriors or others who can't get anything that can fight enemy elite units in melee. These are quite slow, and often you won't be transporting this. You often won't be paying for a drop pod or anything like that for your Dreadnoughts. So because melee Dreadnoughts are slowish, they'll often be walking across the battlefield, and that means they can have quite limited impact on the early game. Even if they've got a gun in their fist, they're generally short range as well. So for the first turn, maybe 2, a lot of the time these Dreadnoughts won't do anything as a drawback. And then the third type of Dreadnought is the Mixed Role Dreadnought. So this is 1 gun and 1 melee weapon, the sort of classic Dreadnought configuration. This lets you get value from the Dreadnought's great melee abilities that it's got, while still providing some fire support with a very accurate gun, and their guns are generally very cheap as well. That flexibility comes at the cost of a little bit of inefficiency technically, so when you go into combat you're not shooting your gun, or when you're shooting you've got a fist which is maybe not doing a lot, but that's not really a big deal because these Dreadnoughts are so good. So that's the 3 different types of roles you'll generally be outfitting a Dreadnought for. Some general considerations then when thinking about Dreadnought loadouts. So your Dreadnought itself is the biggest cost, 175 points. You're paying for a big, tough platform with great stats, great abilities, fearless, immune to pinning, all that kind of stuff. And that means that you shouldn't necessarily skimp on its upgrades. Its upgrades aren't that expensive, really, given what you're putting them on is a very effective model. The fist-mounted guns are a bit expensive compared to the main guns, so when you're getting a multi-melter for 5 points with 2 shots, paying 15 points for a melter gun can seem a little bit expensive. Those things are generally still worth it though, because the Dreadnought is just so cheap and good that any gun you put on it is good. But if you do need to save points in your army for something else, not taking these upgraded fist guns on the Dreadnought is definitely worthwhile or worth considering. You can shave points here if you need to. Using the dual gun loadout does waste a lot of the Dreadnought's potential. Weapon skill 5, brutal 3 on them fists, very tough to kill, exerts a lot of sort of control over the area the Dreadnought's in. If you're using double guns, you do waste a lot of what the Dreadnought can do. Now, obviously there are advantages to that, as I've mentioned. Being a very tough sniper that people ignore has lots of advantages in and of itself, but it does often feel like a slightly less efficient way to use the Dreadnought, and I certainly enjoy my las cannon Dreadnought the least of all my Dreadnoughts. Using dual guns also does exacerbate the Dreadnought's weakness to being tied up in melee. Dreadnoughts aren't necessarily great at, units of men, just locking them up. And if you've got no melee weapon to kill them with, you could easily be tied up. So you do want to make sure you stay at range. Normally not a problem with the dual guns you'll generally take, but you don't really want to dual shorter range guns just in case you get locked in combat. I mentioned earlier that having a gun and a melee weapon is technically a bit inefficient because it loses you, some power in either of the things that you do, but it's actually not. If you're in melee, you aren't using your gun. If you're shooting, you could have had a second gun, that's true. But Dreadnought main guns are very cheap, is the real difference here. Like 2 las cannons for only 20 points on ballistic skill 5, as an example, is really good. A Gravis plasma gun cannon for 10 points is really good. So the real cost is only 1 attack of combat potential to gain that gun. And generally, I think the absolute best way to run Dreadnoughts is with 1 gun and 1 melee weapon. As a rule, you can't really go wrong with that. You have to get used to the range disparity, so the weapons in the fists are a bit shorter range than the big guns, generally, and that is a drawback, and sometimes that fist won't be shooting. You just have to sort of get used to that. There's no real way around that. You can try to pair the weapons appropriately, but a lot of the time, the fact that they've got different ranges is just the thing you have to deal with. An important thing to do to get a good Dreadnought loadout is to match the weapons that want to shoot at similar targets, so don't mix anti-infantry and anti-tank, for example. If you're going to take some kind of anti-tank weapon like a multi-melter or a las cannon, you don't want to then go and put a plasma blaster in your fist, for example, because they're not necessarily like wanting to shoot at the same targets. Or if you're going to use a Kerry's assault cannon, you might not want a melter gun in your fist. So try to make sure the weapons both want to shoot at the same thing. Ultimately, I think one important thing before we go into all the detail is that most things will be good on a Dreadnought. Like, if you like certain weapons that I don't consider good, there's nothing wrong with using them, because Dreadnoughts are always good. They're just very powerful. But especially if at least one of those things is a fist, you can't really go wrong, because as long as the Dreadnought can punch things in melee, it's always going to be good, regardless of what guns are on it. So don't be afraid to use what you think looks cool, or what you think looks fun. If you're going to do that, I would definitely recommend making one of the weapons a fist, but, you don't have to abide by everything that I'm about to go into. So first, let's just go over some of the weaker weapon options. These are the ones you generally want to avoid on your Dreadnoughts. Gravis autocannon. It's got low shots. It's only got 3 shots. I don't know why. It feels like I should have had more. Its damage potential just isn't very good. Basic autocannons like this are not very good, and certainly it's not a good way to use your expensive ballistic skill 5 Dreadnought. It's 10 points as well, which is quite expensive compared to the other weapons a Dreadnought can have. So that's not a very good weapon at all. Gravis bolt cannon is worse. Again, does keep your Dreadnought cheap, but you paid 175 points for your Dreadnought. You want it to be able to do things, and this weapon doesn't really do that. It's just a massive waste of your Dreadnought's potential. It does look cool, unfortunately, but it means that people can just ignore the Dreadnought because it's not really shooting or doing a lot. And the conversion beam cannon, the last one. Now, we all know conversion beams are a bit of a meme weapon, but as with anything conversion beam related, it's generally too hard to keep her at range. The range is just too long you've got to be at, whilst also maintain a line of sight on any decent board with decent terrain. And when it does hit, it's not even actually that powerful, really. Just a blast with AP1 is something you can get from other weapons effectively without all the complexity, and it's very expensive on the Dreadnought as well. Like compared to other Dreadnought weapons, it's an expensive weapon. So those 3 weapons are weapons that I would mostly avoid, although we will talk about ways you can use them if you really want to later on. Now let's talk about all the good weapon options. So firstly, you got the Gravis melter cannon, very cheap at 5 points, 2 multi-melter shots, really good, very reliable with twin linked. You'll almost always hit with both of these shots with ballistic skill 5. Really good for killing elite infantry. Shooting these into Terminators and getting maybe 1 or even 2 kills, if you're lucky, is a lot of points of dead stuff. I really like melter guns for killing elite infantry, and it's one of the more reliable ways to hurt armor value 15 as well, is just being at close range with a melter cannon. These have got a 24-inch range, so it's not too hard to get them into armor bane range as well. The short range overall, though, is a drawback. You won't get those armor bane shots easily, and they are less good in pairs due to the threat of being tied up in combat, but generally, putting 1 melter cannon on a Dreadnought and pairing it with a fist or something is generally pretty powerful. Melter weapons, particularly multi-melter weapons, are very good in this game, but it's hard to deliver them. So a tough mobile thing like a Dreadnought being able to deliver them makes them excellent. Then we got the Gravis plasma cannon. So you don't see this very often. It's just come out in the new kit, but you don't see older ones with them very often either. I think these are excellent. One of the top Dreadnought weapons easily. Very good at killing squads of Marines. 5-inch blast. You know, they can also hurt things with a 2+ save easily as well. Not very easy to find that in Legion lists. The Dreadnought does mostly ignore the Gets Hot as well, because it's got a 2+ save. And if you've got a Nuncio Vox in your army with Ballistic Skill 5, these are super accurate as well. So particularly if you're using 2 of these, but even if you're just using 1, dropping that 5-inch blast on enemy Marine units can be really, really killer, and I really like this gun. And it's only cheap at 10 points as well. The Volkite Dual Culverin, now this one nearly made the weak weapons list. It's only got 6 shots, but it is twin linked, so they should all hit most of the time, all 6. It's a bit expensive at 15 points. This probably could have been like 5, I think, so it is a bit on the expensive side. It does have a useful secondary role though, of shooting light vehicles like rhinos. And if you shoot one of these at a rhino, most of the time you're going to glance it twice. Or if you get it in the side, you're going to glance it 3 times and blow it up. So that is kind of a nice thing to have, really. But particularly if you're Iron Warriors, I mentioned this a little bit more. I actually really like these on Iron Warriors because they will mostly just kill a rhino when you shoot it. And the reason I mentioned killing rhinos is because a lot of the time in your army, you've got lots of anti-tank weapons and that kind of stuff. But using a whole squad to kill a rhino is not very efficient generally. You know, who wants to shoot 10 Lascannons at a rhino? Nobody. And what I find in a lot of games is rhinos hang around for a long time because there's nothing you want to shoot at them. So these weapons that on the Dreadnought, you know, paired with a fist, that can just take out light vehicles with reasonable chances, and then also the Dreadnought can go into melee later, I actually think can be workable. The plasma cannon is better for killing Marines and cheaper. You know, if you want to shoot just Marines, this isn't actually a very good gun. The plasma's better, but it does have that secondary role for killing light vehicles. And likewise, the Kerry's assault cannon as well. I mentioned it for the same reason. Also a fairly weak weapon, pretty expensive for what it does, but it's also got that secondary role of shooting light vehicles. And again, is especially good in Iron Warriors. It's pretty reasonable at killing those small things. And, you know, assault cannons do look cool. Rylanor's got an assault cannon. We all love Rylanor, so it does deserve its mention in the weapons section. And, you know, at a pinch also, you can throw these into 2+ save units and hope for the odd wound as well. So, an okay weapon, just very expensive compared to the other options the Dreadnought's got. The Gravis Las Cannon really needs no introduction, so 2 Las Cannon shots on a Ballistic Skill 5 Dreadnought. Las Cannons are just good. And Las Cannons on a Dreadnought are hard to eliminate, as we've talked about before. Pairs pretty well with a helical target array as well for punishing flyers because the range is so long, so wherever that flyer comes on, you're probably going to get the AA shots and you're probably going to kill it, which is, you know, something a lot of flyer players don't like, but is quite a hard thing to get into your army as Legion. The Gravis Power Fist onto the melee weapons is just a good weapon, and this is the source of a lot of the Dreadnought's power, really. Brutal 3 is so powerful. Strength 9, it's going to go through everyone's armor. It's, you know, when you're fighting Terminators or Elites, it's just so good. And if you've only got one melee weapon on your Dreadnought, it should always be one of these. There's never a reason you should take the Chain Fist as a sole melee weapon, in my opinion. But the Chain Fist itself is good. It's a really good upgrade if you go in double melee on your Dreadnought to give it the Chain Fist, because the Power Fist is not actually that good at killing vehicles, particularly tough ones, you know, when you come across something like a Kratos with armor 14. The Power Fist can be a little bit weak. The Chain Fist means you'll pretty much just pen it every time. Rarely worth the 10 points if you go in double melee, definitely. Not mandatory by any stretch of the imagination. You know, you might have other ways to deal with vehicles, but it is a really nice upgrade if you've got the 10 points for it. Just going into the fist-mounted weapon options now, so the Combi Bolter does keep the Dreadnought cheap, and compared to the guns on the Dreadnought, the fist weapons are actually quite expensive, so keeping your Combi Bolter is certainly viable. Likewise, the Heavy Flamer, only 5 points. If you're trying to keep your costs down, there's nothing wrong with the Heavy Flamer. Flaming weapons are pretty good. It is a bit of a waste of the potential of Dreadnoughts when just 5 points more will get you a Plasma Blaster, but you know, sometimes you're at the end of your list build and you just need 5 points somewhere. Could be an option. The Plasma Blaster itself is pretty decent. It's good for infantry hunting. It's got an 18-inch range as opposed to some of the shorter ones in the fist, which is nice. And it's 5 points cheaper than the Melter and Grav as well. It's not super amazing because it's only 2 shots, but they are 2 Ballistic Skill 5 shots, and 10 points to keep that Dreadnought doing more things is pretty decent, and I do like this option. There's also the Graviton gun, which is my favourite fist-mounted weapon by a long way. Haywire is really powerful. Grav templates, if you've not played with or against them, are also very powerful for disruption and damage. You know, if you haywire a vehicle or a Dreadnought with your Graviton gun, and then, it walks through that dangerous terrain, it's maybe another point of damage, and, it does happen as well. And it's got an 18-inch range, which, as opposed to the Melter gun, which is the other 15-point option, is a little bit longer range. So the Melter gun itself is pretty good. 15 points is quite expensive for a Melter gun, though, because of the range is so short. Dreadnoughts are cheap, though, and tough, so it's easy to get Melter shots, and you will certainly get some. But it will mean that short range that you'll often miss 2 or maybe even 3 turns of the game firing, so you're paying quite a lot of points for a gun that you often won't be able to use. And I've kind of gone off the Melter gun a little bit. I do still use it in some builds, but most of the time I would just prefer to take the Graviton gun. And then the last couple of upgrades you've got access to, so the Havoc Launcher is just an extra weapon. It does pair fairly well with infantry hunting weapons, because it's an anti-infantry weapon, but it is expensive for 10 points, and you're probably better off spending points elsewhere in your army. It does look cool, though, and lots of people like putting these on the Dreadnought. It's certainly not a bad thing to have a Ballistic Skill 5, Twin-Linked, Strength 5 template. The Helical Targeting Array, though, is the real superstar on Dreadnoughts. So it gives you Interceptor, which is obviously always powerful. It also gives you Skyfire if you want it with that Interceptor for shooting at things in the air. And it can just let you ignore Shrouded, which is also really good. Being able to ignore the Shrouded reactions on things like Javelins is quite powerful because they don't get their reroll Shrouded. Being able to ignore evade reactions when things evade what you're shooting Dreadnought is just really good. And for 10 points, this is just great. It's pretty much an auto-include on any Dreadnought that's running 2 guns. You should pretty much just take this all the time because it just does good things, particularly if those guns are long-ranged. You might not always get to intercept the things if you're running 2 multi-melters because they're shorter range, but anything that's like 36 plasma cannon or longer, you always want that option. Ultimately, this is actually very strong on any Dreadnought, even a single gun Dreadnought, and if you find the points for it, or if you've got some spare points at the end of your army, this is a great thing to add on. Let's take a look at some loadouts that I would recommend for your Dreadnoughts then. These are loadouts that I use in my armies. So dual las cannons and a helical targeting array is like the classic fire support Dreadnought for Heresy 2, at least for me, as classic as anything can be at this point. It's just really good for killing vehicles, Dreadnoughts, good at shooting elite infantry as well. You make your points back shooting them, and it's hard for your opponent to kill. It also brings you anti-air and anti-reserves capability as well. Does a lot for 225 points. Likewise, the dual plasma cannon Dreadnought is something I really love, and I think gets overlooked a lot with a helical target array. This is only 200 points, really cheap. Excellent at killing infantry of any kind. Also good at shooting at enemy heavy support squads. A lot of the time, trying to kill enemy heavy support squads can be quite painful because of the return fire, but even if they've got las cannons, Dreadnoughts are pretty tough to that kind of stuff, so shooting them with this can take return fire, not die, take a bunch of them off the board. Also very good at anti-infantry deep strike. When people are bringing those guys out of drop pods, they tend to be a little bit bunched up. You drop 2 5-inch templates on them, you're going to kill a lot of them. So this is another really good loadout. And we get into the single weapon and gun loadouts. Now, in my opinion, you can pretty much pair any weapon with a fist and the Dreadnought will be good, but here are the ones that I like the most. So Melter Cannon, Power Fist, and a Graviton gun or Melter gun, your preference, are very good. Great for shooting at elites, Dreadnoughts, vehicles. It's got those high strength, instant death shots. You're going to be up close. You might be around a unit of Terminators that you then want to charge, soften them up a bit first. Obviously also good at killing all those things in melee. And because the Melter Cannon's so cheap, this comes in at a really cheap 195 points as well, which is really good. Likewise, I like Plasma Cannon, Power Fist and Plasma Blaster. Similarly, slightly different roles. So good at killing infantry at, whatever range you want to shoot them at, and it can kill elite infantry. It will knock wounds off Dreadnoughts because it breaches as well. The mixed range is a little downside on this because the Plasma Cannon's got double the range of the Plasma Blaster. But, a lot of the time you'll be closing with the enemy to use your Power Fist anyway. And again, 195 points for this is really cheap. Pairing a las cannon with a Power Fist and a Graviton gun for 200 points is also good. So in this configuration, we're kind of forgetting that the las cannon's got a long range and we're just aiming to close with enemy vehicles. We will be shooting the las cannon on the way in, but once we get closer, we've got a haywire gun and a las cannon to shoot at things like vehicles and Dreadnoughts. And of course, then we're going to get stuck in with our Power Fist as well. I like this one a little bit less than using Melter with it, just because, you know, the Melter is just like 15 points cheaper and basically does the same thing. But the las cannon does definitely have the advantage of being able to shoot vehicles in the early turns as well, or maybe just, you know, snipe out some lighter vehicles in the early turns before they get to move. And then talking about melee configurations, of which there are a surprising amount, given they're all basically the same weapons. So Power Fist and Chain Fist with combi bolters, that's only 185 points, and I mention this one just because it is so cheap. Powerful melee threat versus absolutely any target at all that you care to throw it into. And if you want to make it even cheaper, you don't even need the Chain Fist, really. You can just go 2 Power Fists, 2 combi bolters, you know, something else can kill vehicles in your army. This doesn't need to be bothered doing it. And you just got this super powerful combat unit running around for 175 points. Really, really good. Really, really cheap. The tooled up melee version of a Dreadnought, which is still not really that expensive. Power Fist, Chain Fist, and 2 Graviton guns. Again, powerful melee versus any target, and you can start putting some damage on vehicles or Dreadnoughts at range with the Graviton guns, or you can disrupt enemy troops and things that want to move with them Graviton guns as well. They're just a really good weapon. This is just a great loadout for the Dreadnought. Now, I like this over Melter guns because the Graviton guns have got longer range, and because you got the Chain Fist, if you are going to charge a vehicle, you've got a good chance of just, you know, softening it up and then killing it first, where the Melter, you know, sometimes against harder targets might not penetrate, where this is really good for taking those AB-15 things off the board, but really just good at everything it wants to fight. Also as well, you've got dual Gravis Power Fist with dual Plasma Blaster or Melter Gun, I quite like as well. So this is, again, powerful melee threat. We're keeping the cost down by not putting the Chain Fist on, although, again, you can add it on if you want to, if you got the 10 points. Really good for knocking wounds off enemy elite infantry or dreadnoughts with the plasma. You know, whatever you're going to go in and fight, you can just knock some wounds off them, then go in with your dual power fists. But if you are going to take a chain fist, you know, you could definitely put melters on this as well. And then you've also got the options to be hunting vehicles. You don't really want to mix the plasma and the chain fist at the same time because they're kind of mixed use case. But, you know, you obviously can if you've got spare points. Ultimately, as you can see from this, melee dreadnoughts with things in the fists just generally good. Now, there was some weapons I talked about at the start that I said are fairly weak, but some ways to use those weapons. So, if you're going to use conversion beams, you might as well take 2. If you're going to go to all the trouble of trying to keep yourself at a long range, you might as well have 2 of that weapon and make sure you use them. Bring a Nuncio Vox somewhere else in your army as well, because you might not get many chances to shoot with that big AP1 blast. So, make sure the shot is going to count. And obviously, because you've got 2 guns, give them a helical targeting array as well. They might as well be shooting those 2 guns at anything that's coming in from reserve. And they do blind as well, so if things drop down from reserve, you blind them, they can't assault out of their assault pods or whatever. That's also a pretty decent thing. And then for the bolt cannon and the auto cannon, if you want to make them work, and I have seen a lot of people with auto cannons modelled on the Dreadnoughts because they were one of the cooler weapons in the first kit, cool looking weapons, basically just pair them with a fist. Make sure that you can use the Dreadnought's melee. You're definitely going to get value out of it. The combi bolter in a fist for those would be good to keep your Dreadnought cheap and, you know, offset the fact that its main gun's not very good. Or you can alternatively pair it with a plasma blaster, which is the weapon that most closely matches bolt cannons and auto cannons for shooting, you know, generally light troops or light things. Auto cannon and bolt cannon do both work a little bit better in Iron Warriors. Again, Iron Warriors get a lot of mentions with low strength volume weapons like these, so they're a bit better there. Graviton gun can also work with the auto cannon as well if you're going to be shooting at light vehicles, you know, hoping for the rend, hoping for the glances, and trying to get them off the table. So that's quite a lot of information. To sum that all up, in my experience, a Dreadnought with at least one melee weapon is the scariest thing to face, or the best thing to use. But the dual las cannons and dual plasma cannons particularly, I think, are very effective at what they do. I don't think I like pairing any other guns particularly, but those ones are both potentially very good. You should try to pair fist weapons with guns that are good versus similar targets as well. Be aware of that range disparity, but try to make sure everything on your Dreadnought is wanting to shoot at the same thing to keep it efficient. Any dual melee weapons with any guns in them are really good. The Dreadnought is never going to be bad when it's running around hitting things in combat, whatever it's firing at. There are some recommended loadouts there, but you can basically make all of them work. The helical target array is something you definitely don't want to forget about. It gives you AA ability, hard to come across. And all Dreadnought loadouts, ultimately, are actually good. I want to just remind everyone of this, because you might have looked at this video and thought, the Dreadnought I've built or what I've modelled it with isn't optimal. Dreadnoughts are good. So all Dreadnought loadouts are inherently good just because Dreadnoughts are. So don't be afraid to use and enjoy what you think looks cool, even if I've not mentioned it. You can find ways to make all of these weapons work. Particularly if you've got that fist, your Dreadnought's always going to be good. That's the end of the show. Thanks very much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you have, please do leave me a like and a subscribe on YouTube. And if you've got any comments at all, please leave them down below. See you all next time. Bye-bye.